Welcome to the Seafood Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jim Cowie. In each episode, I speak with industry leaders, fishery scientists, fishermen, and seafood chefs. We'll highlight the importance of seafood in our daily lives, economy, and environment. Whether you catch your own seafood, love cooking it, or want to learn more about where your fish comes from, you'll find it all here on the Seafood Matters podcast. If you enjoy this episode, hit subscribe, share it with a friend, or leave a 5-star review. And you can get in touch with me by visiting seafoodmatterspodcast.com. Park OBE is Chief Executive Officer of the Scottish Whitefish Producers Organisation, representing 260 individual vessels and 1,400 fishermen. In this episode, Mike returns to the show to further detail the intricacies and controversies of annual quota negotiations. Mike explains how certain NGOs distort facts, sue governments and attack the marketplace, attempting to stop the public from buying certain species of seafood. Mike delivers a clear message to the NGOs, warning that their false misinformation and lies might eventually destroy the UK fishing industry. Welcome to Seafood Matters, Mike Park, a real friend of the show. What's your feelings about how negotiations went, and do you feel you came away from the table with everything that was available to you for your members?
As fishermen, we always want everything, but I think taking into account what we asked for, taking into account some of the negative positions that were delivered ahead of the negotiation in terms of ICES headline advice on cod, in terms of the proposed reduction of 12% in monkfish. If you then balance it against all that, I think the position that we came out with was okay. It was fair. There's been a number of years before, Jim, where Alex Smith and I, coming home from December councils, discussed whether we should get a flight to Tenerife or go back to Aberdeen because the outcome was that bad. But no, I thought this outcome was reasonably fair, taking account of some of the hurdles that we faced ahead of the negotiations.
Well, that's good that you feel that way, because that'll come across to the members. Do you ever feel that when you're in that negotiations and part of it, you're a good poker player?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I guess we don't get to play the poker. I guess what we do is we're the sort of like, or we try to be the puppet master behind the poker player. And even then, the poker player will take into consideration what he wants to take into consideration. But I think my role and role of others like me, Jim, is to make sure that they're aware of all the information, both in terms of the ICES advice, but also in terms of the socio-economic impacts of decisions if they get it wrong. And for me, that's the issue of trying to keep their feet to the fire. That you can work out in your own mind what you think the pinch points are for them in terms of managers trying to solve a problem and come to a decision. Because in all of that, I think what we need to understand is that the negotiators and indeed the ministers that they represent are under immense pressure continuously from the Greens. And if they get anything really wrong of a magnitude, then they're going to end up in court. They're going to be judicial reviews or whatever. And indeed, you know, we find that's what's happening with Article 25 in the Fisheries Act, that's getting challenged now, which is about the allocation of quota and various other things. So we've got to be mindful as fishing leaders that you don't get everything you want. So what you need to do is position yourself so that you get the things that are important to you.
Yeah. And are you mindful during that times that the people on the other side they're influenced by the fact that they can be taken to court?
Oh, yeah, very much so. Very much so. And, you know, the officials, they won't tell you as much, but as an industry now, we're very, very well aware that they're trying to position the minister so that he's got a reasonable response to any accusations. Because what an official can't do is expose his minister, you know, openly, so they can be attacked without any protection. So a lot of the decisions now in fisheries negotiations take account of the possibility of legal challenge, the pressure they're coming from the Greens. But as I say, my role and role of others is to make sure that while that's heard, and you can't stop that being heard, that we are also feeding in some of the empirical evidence about the stocks in a reasonable and sensible way, but also making them aware of that socio-economic impact should they get it wrong. For me, that's the main reason for us being there, is to try and balance the argument.
Unless there's something I'm missing, Mike, one of the things I feel wrong about it, I've spoken previous podcasts to various scientists, fishermen, people in all sectors, and guys like yourself have a huge respect right the way through. And as you said in our previous podcast, you're a guy you'll want to stay in the room. When we were discussing the Thal situation in the past, you were against it because you wanted to stay in the room. I think it's wrong that you're not allowed to stay in the room when they're negotiating.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And it was always our aspirations, as we were going through the Brexit sort of developments, having watched Norway and, the Norwegian industry. And on analysis, even the Norwegian industry doesn't get into the heads. So the negotiations pretty much take three courses. I mean, you've got the plin race where everybody's in, and that's where they lay out the stall. It's like putting up, the boards. This is what we're going to do in the next 3 days. This is the agenda. And they talk round the more placid issues. And then you've got coordination, where the member states, in terms of Europe, all get together to decide their point. And indeed, that's when Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland, England then coordinate, and the Norwegians go back and coordinate. Now, in that coordination, in terms of Norway, the industry gets into that. The next stage after that is where they go into heads, where the heads of each negotiation team go in and they start getting involved in that sort of heavy negotiating. So even the Norwegian fishermen don't get into that. And I can understand somewhat why the UK government is not allowing us into that room in coordination in terms of the UK, because it would expose us to the push and pulls between Scotland, England, or whatever. And I don't think they would want that to come out, because I guess it could get constitutional issues. So I get that. And they do go, especially the Scottish government, we operate with core groups where they try and get us as close as they possibly can without allowing us into that sort of coordination process. But it's difficult because even within the UK, we have companies there that are owned by foreign companies. And indeed, that foreign companies have companies within Europe, and they negotiate from the other side. So I can understand the complexity that we face over the Norwegians, because they don't have that. They're not infiltrated by the same sort of foreign entities. It is difficult, and we always thought as an industry we would be closer, but it's not ideal. And I guess at the time, COVID gave the government time to hide, because of an excuse. Well, you can't come in because we can't meet. We're doing it virtually, so we'll just lock you out in the meantime. It will develop over time, and whether we get into that coordinating process or no, I'm not entirely sure. It's less than ideal, but it's better than what it was when we were a member of the EU.
Yeah. Are we needing to start a campaign, get Mike in the room?
Of all the campaigns I think we should run, when you look at the probability of success, it's probably pretty far down the list, to be fair. As long as we're listened to. And remember, in a democratic society, we get access to officials. We can ask the fisheries minister for a meeting. We can ask the first minister in Scotland for a meeting. We can even ask the prime minister for a meeting. So we're not knocked out of trying to hold these one-to-one sessions. And indeed, ahead of the most recent negotiations, we met with Mark Spencer in Parliament on 2 occasions ahead of the negotiations. And one was about the need to strike international negotiations. The other one was on cod and the need to abandon the headline advice by ICES and monkfish. So we do get access at that high level. But whereas Mark Spencer's very good and he understands the arguments that you put across, he's a farmer, so he gets a lot of these socioeconomic sort of points. Officials are always trying to protect him in the background from this harangue by the Greens and judicial reviews, etc., so that they've a balance to play as well. We're in the early stages of change since we left Europe, and things will develop significantly over the next decade. So I don't think we should be disappointed. I think what we should do is be empowered but try to make a difference and try to change going forward to the better. So that's what I would say. Let's not be disappointed. Let's build on what we have.
Great attitude. It's a great way to go. It's better working with what you have than always looking for something else. Totally, I 100% agree with that. In fact, on a personal basis, Michael, do you enjoy it?
I do. People always say to me, most of my friends back home are retired, Jim. At 4 o'clock every day, I have a group of friends back home. It's like a marine version of Last of the Summer Wine. At 4 o'clock every day, they go out the front, they have their tins of beer, and they sit and they wax lyrical, and they take the mickey out of one another. And even yesterday at 4 o'clock, when I was clear here, I had to do something at home, and I drove down and I'm standing with them, and they take the mickey out of me like they do out of other people. And while that's useful, it's not me. And I do enjoy the work that I do. I've always said to my wife that when I stop enjoying it, then that's the time to stop. I thoroughly enjoy it. I mean, my chairman has just left my office a second ago, and we were talking about various things. And even that, just catch up about where are we, where are we going? What do we need to do? What do we need to put in place? And these regular discussions and the fact that you're writing policy papers, you're trying to write papers to make the working lives of the crew better. In fact, this morning I put out a report on social policy within the fishing industry in terms of worker-driven social responsibility. So all these sort of things, when you piece it together, makes a difference. And all anyone wants to do in life is to have the ability and the position to make a difference. And I think, the position I have allows you to make that difference. But that's about building up respect. It's about being reasonable. It's about being rational. But I do enjoy it, Jim. It's as much as I do getting out in the garden in the summer, cutting the grass, as much as I do going over the hills with my dog on the quad. Yeah, for me, leads to what I would class as a fulfilling life.
It's really interesting, a really interesting job you have. And I would almost be inclined to, from what you're saying, having been at discussions at the level of fisheries ministers and in Brussels and talking to all that people from different nationalities, it's almost like you would need to stop and speak to your pals on the street, because it sort of takes you back to terra firma and lets you...
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm sure a lot of people walk by thinking, why is he standing with them? But these were the guys that I went out to the creels with when I was 9 years old. These are the guys that I built creels with all winter because there was nothing else to do. One was a master in the merchant navy. Well, he was a chief engineer in the merchant navy, and the other one was in the oil industry, very high up in the oil industry. But that's the thing. They live down the harbour, 4 o'clock every day. They go out with a tin of beer and they sit and they have a chin wag. And I guess you get the same around many, many coastal villages. And it's great to see. They don't have a care in the world. They don't care. They sit and discuss politics, although their politics is not in line with mine. And they take the mickey out of one another, and they take the mickey out of me. Yeah, they always think that I don't have a tin of beer because I'm going to be home to have my nice gin and tonic. So that's just what they say.
Brilliant, brilliant. Going back to the negotiations, IC's recommending a 17% drop this year. It's finished up, I think it's a 15% increase. Is that in any ways seen as a bargaining position? Because the swings that they have, no fisherman can see that level of swings in the fish stocks.
No, we discussed this last podcast. I think you discussed it in one previously with Mark Dickie-Colas, who was chair of ACOM at ICES.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, ICES overstepped the mark by suggesting minus 17% cutting the new cod stock, the three stocks, the northern stocks and that. And they acknowledge that now. Now, whereas the advice in the best case scenario, I think it pointed to 25% increase, that was always going to be difficult. And the reason it was going to be difficult was related to a discussion we had just a short time ago, was that the EU just now has been taken through court on that very, very same aspect about setting quotas higher than the advice. So in that negotiation, Europe was never going to take it to its limit because it didn't want to be seen to changing that barometer. It didn't want to be seen to be doing that. So it then laid down to Norway and the UK to try and push up the percentage. Norway said, well, we'll take pretty much what you decide. The UK didn't want to be responsible for pushing it up too far either. Just that optics again, the green optics about challenges through court, judicial reviews. So that's why it was seen as reasonable to change it to a positive, but not to go the whole way. And that's where it ended up at the 15%. Not ideal, because the 25% was purely achievable within sustainable approaches, but the optics of politics suggested that it couldn't go there, and that's why we stuck at 15%. Now, hopefully, Jim, that by setting it at 15%, we're banking more fish for the future, and hopefully the stock will grow quicker than would grow if we took out the 25%. So hopefully what we've done is put our money in the bank with that, and we get the interest of it next year and the years after. And that would be the hope. But the fleet's got to respond positively in that way as well, because at the end of the day, you can only catch a fish once. So we've got to make sure that try and avoid what we don't need and bank that for the future years and try and stabilise our stocks. We'll never ever get what we want as fishermen, but we should get what we need in the meantime while protecting the stocks. And very much so, that's the change in attitudes now, that we don't necessarily want everything, but we need as much as we can to keep the business in place while trying to put security back in the stocks. And this thing about the fish stocks is the investment, and the interest you get from it is the yield. So we need to make sure that we protect the stocks to make sure they're big enough to produce that yield that as an industry keeps us going for the foreseeable future. Because it's not about just today, it's about tomorrow and the year after that. And it's not about just this generation, it's about the generation that comes after that and after that. So we need to be rational in mind enough to understand that protecting the stocks is more important than the smash and grab in the here and now.
Yeah. Is there any measure within this, all these people that are talking in courts? Is it only scientists' figures they go by? Anything else? Nature?
Yeah. I mean, the managers, the science is what it is. And a lot of people say science is political. I'd like to think it's not. It maybe doesn't take account of everything all the time. But science is one of the things that goes into a pot in the negotiations. And then you've got the socioeconomics and everything of the various fleets in the various countries. And that's where managers come into play. And they have to try and strike that fine balance. Now, empirical evidence feeds in there somewhat, but it probably doesn't feed in as much as we would have hoped. And when we had the recent cod symposiums, one ahead of the cod benchmark recently and one after, we thought that was the start of a process where we were going to be welcomed further in, play a bigger part of that scientific output. But it seems now that ICES is trying to strong arm us out of there again because they don't have the time and it doesn't produce anything much more than what they currently have. So that's disappointing. And I think the Northern Fishing Alliance, which meets in April this coming year to discuss what it's going to do in the future, I think we need to work out how we can then re-engage with ACOM and make sure that they do appreciate the empirical information, just accept that the industry has got some merit for being in the room, and being in the room rather than out of the room is the best way ahead. So I think we've got some work to do there. But everybody's under pressure, Jim, and nobody has a lot of time to do anything. And I think that's probably part of the problem, more so with ICES than anyone.
Yeah, where I'm coming from, Mike, and it's just my thought, but in that negotiations, I would picture the fact where your background, your own personal background, your position in the body you're in, the SWFPA, and the members, you mentioned speaking to your chairman just before that, Davey, we know very well, he has a huge depth of knowledge background in the industry. All you have at your disposal, personally and with members in that, you must have better information than anybody else in that whole negotiation.
Yeah. Well, we have our knowledge, which is based on what we do and what we catch. And that's empirical knowledge. It's our knowledge. There's no time series that we keep. We don't gather that information under strict protocols like the scientists gather their information. But there is things that we can produce. So, for instance, let me give you an example that haddock, we didn't catch all our haddock quota last year. Now, some would think you didn't catch it because it's not there. Well, the reason we didn't catch it is because we couldn't sell it. So we left it in the sea as responsible fishermen. So it's empirical information like that that's very, very useful. But if the industry really wants to be heard, then we need to get our own self-sampling programs in place and start to feed that in. And Elena, through the science work that they do within the SFF for the Scottish Government, pretty much do that, although we put observers out there. But we probably need to move into almost self-sampling programs so that the industry and all its platforms, its vessels, does provide that science rather than just fishing platforms. And I think transitioning into that would do us a lot of good. But unlike the pelagic who do it on herring and got large vessels, high number of crew, for us it's more difficult. We've got a lot of number of smaller vessels, vast number of species we need to monitor. So there is a lot of work to be done there. But our main role, I think, is making sure that the voice of the communities are heard, the voice of the industry is heard, and they take some account of what we are seeing at the sea. But a lot of the meetings I'm in, if there's scientists in the room, they say, well, you do think there's a lot of fish because if you want a sweetie, you go to a sweetie shop. So if you're fishing cod, you know where to go and get them and you go and hit them. So you would obviously think there's a lot of cod there because that's what you do for a life and that's what your business is based on. And when you're faced with things like that, and well, you would say that it's like the foxes guarding the chickens. What else would you say? These are things that we still face daily when we go into these negotiations. But as an industry, Jim, I think going forward, we've got to work out how we can better present ourselves in terms of the information that we get every haul, every day, every week of the year. Try and put that into some rigid format that they can accept. And then as an industry, we'll be heard far better.
The industry certainly seems to be working hard on communicating more with it, various players within the industry and other bodies around it.
Yeah, through the Federation, the Scottish Fishermen's Federation is functioning well. You know, we all feed into that. And astonishingly, the industry's got a number of real quality scientists there. You know, in our midst, we've got a population modeler, Rufus Danby. We've got Kenny Cool, who used to work for the Marine Lab. The SFF has got Nina Valentine. They've got Elena Balestra. The pelagic industry has got Steve Mackinson, Ian Napier. The SFO's got Paul McDonald. So the industry itself now has actually got a lot of knowledge, not just by the fishermen, but a scientific community of our own right, which we are using well through organisations such as the Northern Fishing Alliance. And they've really delivered some really quality papers over the recent years.
You see, when we're mentioning the negotiations and you mentioned the cod and monk quotas, baffling a lot of fishermen the fact that for all the information they have on monkfish, and they still class it as data poor. Do you know how that can possibly still be the case?
Yes, I'm going to qualify this by saying I'm not a fisheries scientist, but I do understand some of it. The missing element in there, as I understand it, Jim, was to be able to, with any degree of certainty, dictate what length at age was. That was the real difficulty, because it's very difficult to age a monkfish because it doesn't have the traditional otolith. If where it is, it's just like a tree trunk, so it's more difficult. But positively, there is a benchmark of monkfish just a way to begin. I think it is next week, whereby there will be various models looked at, and hopefully within a short period of time, monkfish will become an analytical stock. So it'll be treated the same as cod, haddock, whiting, saithe, and others. So that's a positive step forward. And what that will do is take it out this annual downward spiral of the quota. Whereas caught in a model just now, unless there's a significant increase in the survey data, then it just continues to go down. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the level of opportunities will be significantly greater. What it does do, though, is remove this downward spiral, even supposing the stock is increasing slowly each year. So that's a positive. But I guess even there, one of the disappointing things is it may not be used for 2025. It may only be used for 2026 if indeed they settle on a model, which then leaves us subject, perhaps, to a 30% cut in monkfish for 2025. Now, that would be really disappointing if the stock is showing a continued increase in abundance. And I hope that answers you, Jim.
It certainly does, but why would they cut it next year? Is it to give them a better position for going into 26, or is there a scientific reason?
It's the output of this new model they're using for data poor. Unless you get a significant increase in abundance, then it naturally takes you down. And that's the ridiculousness of all this, that the monkfish stock could be moving up in an upward trajectory, yet your TAC could still continue to go down. It's really disappointing and it's really frustrating. And the Northern Alliance produced a couple of charts last year showing the minister how ridiculous this was, because we're still above the long-term average of abundance. Yet the TAC is just a fraction of what it was before. But that's something within the Alliance we'll have to pick up and produce before the end of year, a paper just showing the positives, I guess.
The other thing that I find almost between disappointing and annoying is you talk about the Greens taking the government to court. They get their information exactly the same place as the government gets it, from ISIS.
Yeah, and there are some cases where the science has been set higher. But having said that, it hasn't been all caught. We've left fish in the seas, which means that we haven't taken out what the original science said. But in the majority of these organisations that are challenging government, Jim, have a starting point of they don't like mobile gear. They just don't like mobile gear. And that's why they're attacking government. And what we now see with others like Open Seas, they're now attacking the marketplace. They sent an open letter to the retailers recently on Scampi, saying that they should not purchase Scampi because there was so much discards in the industry, etc. And the failure to change any regulations means that that's why they're now challenging the market to disrupt the market. And they did it recently through Fisheries in Progress about crew welfare, crew well-being, which means that we've now to answer to that case. And this is typical. If you go way back when we were a member of Europe and the alterations to the deep sea regulation, an organisation at that time, Bloom FR, headed up by a woman called Claire Novillon, tried to ban bottom trawling below 200 metres. They didn't manage it, and we got it set at 800 metres. And we spent 3 or 4 months in Brussels lobbying hard on that. Failure to deliver a change to the regulation meant that she then focused her resources on destroying the market. And she pretty much did that, Jim. She pretty much destroyed the sale of deep sea species in France, which means that there's very few boats now fishing deep sea species. And when they do, they get a price for so much before it collapses very early on. So that's the impact that organisations like this can have. They start on regulation. If they fail there, they just attack the market. And it could be spurious claims, such as the one recently with Open Seas. But nonetheless, the market has heard it and it listens to it.
I totally accept that, and I've had first-hand experience of it. When I was running my restaurant, I would get people seeing cod in my menu and saying, "Oh, we can't have that, it's not sustainable." And they've got it in from the Marine Conservation Society, or blue this or green that. And I would go into details and I'd tell them it ticks every box: sustainable, local, everything.
I mean, these organisations have got a place. I mean, they think they're the sort of moral compass for wider society. And okay, that's fine. I get that. But don't try and wreck an industry based on false information. And one of the recent ones, just to show your listeners how ridiculous this is, in the letter to the retailers telling them to pull back from buying UK Scampi, they cited discards within the nephrop sector. And the paper they cited was a trial, I think, and I might get this wrong, but I think it was in 2012. And the discard information they used was the information from the control net. So when you're doing any trial, you've got the mesh size you're trialing, say it's 120 mil, and then you'll tow a mesh whereby you catch everything so that you can monitor one against the other and the selectivity criteria thereof. And the information for discards they used was from the control net, which means that is just typical misinformation. It's spurious and it's typical and it's with intent. And that's the disappointing element in all of this for me, that if you want to be the moral compass for wider society, fine. Don't base it on lies.
Do you not feel as well a lot of their agenda is any of their website, the first thing you see is a massive big box, donate here?
Yeah, and if you dig deep, you probably find that a lot of their funding comes from central resources or goes through various avenues. But the seed funding ordinarily is from large America funders like Esme Fairburn, Packard Foundation, all these in America. And it's a web. It's a web. And they're all trying to do the same thing, which is essentially banning mobile gear because they think it's destructive on the seabed and it catches species in quantities that you shouldn't be catching them. And that pretty much under supports, I guess, all the sort of views that they're taking.
Mike, I know you're not a spokesman for ISIS, but have you a view on quite a few conversations? You mentioned it yourself. In fact, I thought fair play to you in our previous podcast, how the younger generation coming through of scientists were keener on collaboration with fishermen and a value in it. But fishermen don't see that. Now, is this something that's in its early days and it'll be like the other things you mentioned, that it'll be something that'll get better?
You would like to think so, Jim. I know within our organisation, if we get any PhD students coming on, scientific students looking for help or interviews or whatever, we always give them on the basis that the more they know about the industry, the better it is for us. And you're never sure where they're going to pop up in the future. So we always try and help at that level. And any young scientist coming into the system comes in without an axe to grind. But I think we have to remember that ICES is full of very, very clever people, and ordinarily they're the government's representatives. So although they're younger than us, essentially they're not that young, and they're quite high up in the institutes that they come from, both in Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Denmark, anywhere you want to mention. But you're right, they are a new breed coming through the system. And you would like to think that their attitudes about collaboration and cooperation is perhaps somewhat different from those that are now leaving the system. And I think industry has got a lot to do to make sure that they think that we're worthy providers of information and data and knowledge. And I think the industry's got a bit of a campaign in its hands to make sure that that develops in the right way. The IC structure itself doesn't really lead or doesn't lend itself well for real industry involvement. We get tacit involvement, and indeed, one of my staff, Kenny Cool, Elena, and Rufus, will be over in Copenhagen during this benchmark for monkfish, and I'm sure they'll make their points. Whether they're heard as well as they would like to be heard, I guess, is another question. But I think if you were saying to me, what is the one of 10 things that you'd like to see change significantly over time, it would be the part that we play in the creation of the sort of output from ICES. That would be extremely useful, because I guess you could suggest that it is still pretty much a closed shop, although they have given us some access in the past, but we've got to make sure that we continue to build on that.
Yeah, as you say, it's always work to be done. Going on to mention our friend Alan Addison earlier, one of his major concerns in a recent podcast, and you mentioned static gear and the NGOs don't like it. Well, the fishermen certainly don't like it, because there's the gill netters and longliners fishing the west of Shetland down the west coast. Alan was just saying about how we really fear, fairness to him, and not from the way it's hitting his pocket or pay packet, but the effect it's having on the future stocks and the seabed. He reckons he's taking tons and tons of disused gill nets and long lines in every trip.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated space because no one has primacy over the sea, and a lot of the frustration stems from the at-sea conflict that's going on in that spatial squeeze. And if you ask the Greens what is more sustainable, is it fishing with lines and gill nets or mobile gears and trawls? Every time they will tell you that it's gill nets and lines. That's the stock answer you would get. And I don't think I'm saying anything that anyone would see, different. The problem there comes is that, well, if you are leaving these nets in the sea and you're discarding, what's the element of ghost fishing? And the other thing is that if you are being selective and you're only catching the fish you want, is all that fish being reported? And there has been an increasing level of activity west of Shetland and west of the Western Isles, primarily as a result of poorer fish being south. There was a nematode, Anisakis, appearing in the flesh of the fish south, and it was getting a poorer price. So I think all the fleet has moved north. But Alan is right in as much that it doesn't matter what you fish with, whether it's gill nets, lines, or mobile gear. If there is more coming out of the sea than the science says should come out of the sea, if you're living by maximum sustainable yield or sustainable approaches, then eventually that will cause you a problem. And I think there's a big debate about how is it that some of these vessels can stay in the grounds so long and catch so little, yet they continue to come back. And I think for me, that's the biggest issue. Take away the spatial element, because that is something that we need to try and manage, because we can't do anything discriminatory under the TAC, or the TCA rather, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. But I think the government has got a role here to make sure that there's not a significant amount of fish being removed from that sea area that's not reported. We've got to live to the registration of buyers and sellers, etc. But the understanding is when you look at what their catch levels would have to be if they were living within their quotas, then they wouldn't be there. And there's a distinction here between UK flag vessels that have significant quotas and those that are coming from Spain or flagged through France or vice versa. There is a big question mark about the level of fish being removed from these vessels, and that's where it becomes unsustainable. If there was the quota to go around and everyone was fishing within the limits, then chances are you wouldn't see that stock being fished down. But Alan and others are there to see firsthand the state of the stock compared to what it used to be before in that particular area. If we then get on, Jim, and we move to the spatial conflict element, we've been working with government now for, well, the industry has been on this for about 7 years. We had meetings down in La Coruña and various other places. But more recently, we've been working with the Scottish Government, with some companies in the UK, Shetland, ourselves, trying to work out a solution to the problem. And it's not easy. It's not easy. I mean, you could find, on paper, you could find out what a solution would be. But if you can't enforce it, then there's no solution. We have a meeting with the Scottish Government coming up Friday, where they think they've found a solution to the problem. That'll be immensely interesting. But yeah, it's a difficult one where pressures and temperatures and attitudes change day by day. And we need to find a solution to the problem, or either A, the stock's going to be fished down, or B, someone's going to lose their life over this at-sea conflict, which is not good for anyone.
In fairness, that goes with every side. Don't want that. But when Alan goes on about it, some of the points he made, he knows, and we all know he's right. If he was fishing gill nets and he went down to the Bay of Biscay and shot his gear, he says he guarantees he'd be out of business because they would tow his gear away. And even if he did catch some fish, and if he went in to land them, his landing would be made difficult, they would block his roads, they would damage his fish and burn his lorry, and they would get away with it. And we just seem to stand back and let it happen. But the other worrying thing for him, and I felt the same, Mike, was we were always of the, and I speak for myself as well, I'll put my hand up, we were always of the mind, what's going on? They're never boarded at sea, that boats. They're never monitored when they're landing. In Scrabster, regular, very seldom, if ever, see anybody monitoring a landing. And that was always suspicious, what we're not seeing and what we don't know. But even more alarming, speaking to Alan in the podcast the other day, was he reckons that they've moved north of Shetland. Some of the traditional grounds they fished west of St Kilda. He says there's not a fish left there. Not a fish, nobody gets a fish there. They've moved north, and the way they fish, they're in groups and round each other. And he says, we, the Scottish boats, that's our traditional grounds, but he says we can't get near it. So he knows he would lose his gear in the Bay of Biscay, but they're threatening to take his gear if he shoots in his own fishing ground. And we got to the stage last week there, Mike, where 8 of that boats landed in Scrabster and fished and filled 2 lorries. And then they were all tied up for best part of a week. And one of the better English-speaking skippers told the harbour that they didn't have the fish.
Yeah, that's our worry. I say there is UK-registered liners and gill netters, and we know what their catch per unit of effort is. And they've got quite a significant share of the quota up in Area 6, so they're well within the law. But we do know the amount of time that others are fishing and the amount of quota that they've got at hand, the equation doesn't stack up. It just doesn't stack up. So either they're catching very, very few fish alongside people who are catching far more than them, or they're just not reporting it. And I think the government probably could do more in terms of stealth, use stealth to try and reduce activity rather than ban vessels, which they can't do because it would be discriminatory. But I think we've got to acknowledge that it's not right. The government's situation is that they've got to do everything above the law. But I think significantly more monitoring of these vessels would highlight some of the situations that Alan and others, and indeed myself, think is happening at the moment, whereby fishing and they're just not reporting, they're freezing down. Yeah, it's not a situation that can go on long term, Jim. It's not a situation that can go on long term. Perhaps maybe after 2026, the transition period's over, we can maybe get special provisions in there to put someone in. But as it currently is, we can't ban them, we can't restrict them. But what we could do is monitor them. And that's the big frustration, that we don't seem to be monitoring them.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess the difference there as well, Jim, is that the attitude of the authority to workers in France is significantly different from us. I remember a way back when I was probably 16. When was that? 75? I think we blockaded Aberdeen Harbour.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah, every skipper received a piece of paper for the police. That's not the situation in France, where they just man the barricades and they plough up the motorways. It's slightly different.
Well, look at their farmers just now.
Yeah.
The other worrying thing as part of that, Mike, of this same thing with the gill nets, I was talking in a recent podcast with, I'm sure you know the guy, David Stephen, down in the channel. And I was talking about that. He reckons that there's boats down there. Alan Dwang and the Ajax is one of them. He reckons they're fishing perfectly sustainable. And they'll take their gear in, they'll fix it, and they'll be back out with it. And it just makes me wonder, when the NGOs and the Greens and people like that are in favour of it, I just wondered, is that what they're working on? And they don't know anything about what's going on up here.
Yeah, fishing with gill nets is sustainable. I mean, it doesn't catch small fish, quite selective in what it catches. I guess the problem is when that gear is lost and it starts to ghost fish. I don't know how long it ghost fishes for. And there's a safety aspects about people like Alan Anson picking it up in their nets and all the trouble it causes them. And they lose time, and it's pretty unsafe if you've got hooks swinging about your head and you're hanging out trying to cut off gill nets, etc. But the gear itself is more selective. It's about what's happening around that fishery. And it's about the misreporting in some elements. It's about the lost gear, the dumping of gear, because a number of times our vessels will pick up nets that have been rolled up and tied up. They'll pick up old lines that have been rolled up and tied up as well. So that's knowingly discarding a gear back into the sea, and the problem that can cause other people. I mean, ordinarily, mobile vessels won't discard anything. The only problem they have is if they become fast and drop their gear, which in most cases they recover anyway. So there is that element of it. But we're in the day and age now, Jim, that you should not be removing any more fish from the sea than you're allowed. That's the era we should be in, or certainly the era we're moving into with REM, etc. And it would be really good if the government could clamp down on what we see as blatant misreport. We've asked for control points to be put in, for reporting points if they're running away down to Spain, but we'll see what happens in that space. I'm not entirely sure there's an appetite for it.
That's unfortunate. You're absolutely 100%. I like the way you say it. It's just absolutely straight and to the point, although it's not what we're wanting to hear.
No. It's one of these difficult things, Jim, that if there was an easy route to take, we'd take it. But it's that difficult, and you're bound by such tight sort of guidance in terms of the trade cooperation about what you can and cannot do. The only thing we can do is monitor it. And if there's a reluctance to monitor, then I don't know what we do after that. That's a government responsibility.
Am I right in saying another thing a lot of the fishermen believe? Their nets should have tags on them by law, and they don't. So they shouldn't be able to just get rid of them, because they could be tags and they could be found out whose they are.
Yeah, but if I was going to discard tins of paint in the country, I wouldn't have my name over it. I'd take my name off, and it's exactly the same with tags. Some people see them as foolproof, but if you're going to dump a range of gill nets, all you would do is just cut the rope and take the tags off. So even there's not much can be done. At the end of the day, Jim, you just want people to abide by the law. That's all we're asking. We're not asking for anything that's unreasonable. We just want people to abide by the law in terms of what they're removing from the sea.
I totally agree with what you're saying there, but basically what we're saying, Mike, is they're discarding them, they're not losing them.
Yeah, and well, they'll be losing them in some cases. And I know vessels that don't discard, but there should be a regime there that makes them accountable for their actions. It's probably not in place yet, but hopefully going forward, that there will be measures in place to stop any discarding of gill nets or lines or whatever, and indeed discarding anything at sea.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I had chain of custody, the MSC, I had a chairman in the restaurant in Scrabster. He was up when the then Prince Charles was here, and he talked about the work that they were doing, helping some line fishers, and the problem they were coming up against. It was down in the southern Atlantic. They were putting heavier weights on the line to get them down quicker, because it was catching so many wader birds and seals and that sort of things as well. And I remember at that time, the statistics, we were still part of the EU, and the EU waters at that time, the figures came from Brussels. There was 500,000, they called it mammals, either wader birds, seals, all that, caught in gill net and long lines every year. And they reckon now that's up over 800,000 to a million. And then you get the part that really grates with me, Mike. You talk there about governments frightened that the Greens are going to take them to court. Why do they not go to court about that?
I do. I mean, I think that everyone's trying to do everything they can to reduce the impact on mammals. In west of Scotland, the Cree Lands, you see whales and everything getting tied up in them. And then there's measures you can put in place to resolve that. I think everyone's doing everything they can to reduce their impact on sea mammals, birds. I heard the report by RSPB this morning that thousands of birds are still killed by fishing gear. I don't know if that's true or not. I would doubt it. I know that in terms of line fishing, there used to be a problem with the birds diving for the bait before it sank. But I know, companies like Hooktone, who operate out of Scotland, they've designed their own bird scarers that they tow behind when they're shooting their lines in that to try and protect the seabirds. So I think everybody's doing little amounts everywhere to try and mitigate their impact against sea mammals and birds and other things. But fishing is a business. Things are going to happen that you just can't mitigate against. I mean, you should try and reduce that, but it is difficult. And if you're hauling your net and a gannet dives into your net to get a fish, then, hopefully you would get it out while it's living. But I guess these are impacts. It's very difficult to mitigate against when your net's in the water and you're not near it.
Yeah, I totally accept that, and I think it's the right way to be. It's very ethical. But unfortunately, it seems as if rather than go down that route, we're going round the route to try to stop the Greens taking us to court. And where they should be facing up to that with us.
Yeah, but this is the problem, Jim, and we're facing that, and I'll name them, the open seas at the moment. That whereas we're trying to solve problems, they don't. They just want you to stop fishing, and it's very, very difficult when they're in the meetings you're in, and they become a disruptive element rather than a productive element. And that's what we're finding, that most of these organisations are not concerned about saying anything wrong, but they are concerned about getting their name and their plight in the media. So they'll say anything to get the plight in the media.
Yeah.
And no matter how much money we spend to try and negate the point they've made, it just doesn't matter. The point's out there. And it's very, very difficult to do that. And that's a difficulty with the modern day green organisations, because in the past we would work with Ewan Dunn of RSPB. We would work with Helen McLachlan of WWF because they were reasonable, sensible people. But it seems to be that needle of acceptable behaviour is shifted to the right in terms of some of these organisations, because it's unreasonable attack after unreasonable attack. And the recent one by Open Seas on the crew welfare in the industry, etc., to try and disrupt the scampi market, is following the same strategic model as Claire Nouvion of Bloom FR, what we talked about earlier about the deep sea. If they can't get the regulation changed, let's go after the market space. And we have to see that for what it is.
Yeah, the Marine Conservation Society have been doing the same.
Yeah, there's there's loads of them out there, Jim. In terms of my role, the things we have to deal with now, more often than not, is trying to solve a problem that's been created by a green organisation.
Yeah. Do you feel that they have an agenda for something, or I always was of the mind it was just to appeal to the public and then ask them for their money?
I mean, the likes of Open Seas, they certainly don't want you operating within 3 mile, and they certainly don't want you bottom trawling. I mean, this may sound a ridiculous statement, Jim, but I view Scottish Whitefish as a green organisation. Everything that we've done over the last decades is to be try and improve selectivity, our bottom impact, crew welfare. So everything we've done is to try and improve our footprint that we leave behind. The only difference is that we take account of socio-economic impact. So the goal and the aspirations of WWF and others is not unlike ours. We all want to get to the same place. The difference is that we need to take account of socio-economic factors, and they don't want to take account of that. And that's the only difference. But I would view that my members as, the fishing vessel owners, the same as the members of Open Seas. We just want to be able to do the right thing.
The only comparison I would make with that, Mike, is you're a lot more responsible in your approach.
Yeah, I'd like to think so.
Very much so. Very much so. If I could pop back to the negotiations, does international swaps impact on that?
Well, there's two things there. What we normally do during the international negotiations, with Norway and the EU, is that as they conclude, they agree swaps. We'll give you X if you give us X, and it's normally based on, it used to be called equivalence, but now it's on like comparative financial values. So that takes place at the negotiations, and then during the year with the EU, our POs will enter into negotiation for swaps with POs in other countries in Europe, albeit through the conduit of the government, the national government. So that takes place, I think, I'm not in a PO, but I think it's like 3 times a year. It's like the windows in football. I think they can go in and out and swap at that period of time. But I might be wrong in that, so I won't be held to that one. The difficulty for me, Jim, is that the way we are now conducting our, negotiating balance and transfers between nations is pretty much a legacy of when we were a member of the EU, where when the EU was negotiating with Norway, it would enter into these deals, and then it would just top slice off every member state their share of the amount that was given up, come in or whatever. And we're pretty much doing the same in the UK now, where your government is conducting that transfers with fish, taking account of what it would like to be seen to be taking in globally in terms of into the UK and what it can afford to put out. The problem is that within the UK, it creates losers and winners. You're robbing Peter to pay Paul. So you may have someone, and I'll use 2 species, monkfish and saithe. You may have someone who's a lot of monkfish, and that goes out in a transfer to Norway. Sorry, saithe goes out in a transfer to Norway. Monkfish comes in. But if that fish is allocated to those that catch it, the guy that's given up, the vessel that's given up the saithe, is not necessarily the guy that gets the reward of the monkfish coming in. So government is pretty much acting in a very sort of high-handed, paternalistic manner in terms of that. And I think that needs to change, because fish is an asset. If you don't have fish, you have to lease it in. So whereas government's taking fish off you to create that deal, to replace it, you've got to go and spend money to bring more in to carry you through your operation, whereas others that benefited don't have to spend that same money because they're getting it from government as a result of that swap. So I think throughout this year, I think there has to be some discussion about how we shape these discussions going forward, because I think it's unreasonable on government to create winners and losers. I don't think in this day and age that's a fair approach. It's certainly not the most intelligent approach. So I think we need to sit down and discuss how that goes. The function is right. Having the ability to do that is right. But I think the discussion about what goes out and what comes in drops a level from government to the POs, and they work out what they want to give in relation to what they want to get back. And I think that's the area we need to move into. The good thing for me is, Jim, that I don't get involved in that, so I can say anything I want.
Are you not involved in that talks at all?
Well, very, very lightly, but the discussion going forward needs to be with the POs. They need to be the people in there, and they are. But essentially, the government decides what goes into that swaps. But I think the discussion's got to come down now to the PO and the vessel level about what they're willing to give up for what they want to take in. And that'll avoid the winners and losers.
So, to make it clear to our listeners, what is swap? This is not something that's created before negotiations or that. So what is swap? As you said, saithe, given to the Norwegians. Each and every UK boat is going to get less because of that.
That's correct. So you're giving out one species and bringing in another species. And let's saithe and monkfish is useful examples that you'll give saithe to Norway, for instance, and you get back monkfish. That's very simplistic. But you give saithe to Norway, you get monkfish back in return, and the monkfish goes to a completely different set of boats that gave up the saithe to secure the deal. And that in itself creates this winners and losers. And whereas government will always say, well, it's in the national interest, you try telling that to some vessel, it's just
Oh
lost 30
yeah,
tons of saithe, and he's got to spend
absolutely,
money to lease it coming in. So,
absolutely.
these are the discussions that we need to have going forward, Jim.
And even apart from the, like, comparing, say, saithe and monk, it would be whitefish and pelagic, so it'd be a completely different fishery as well.
Yeah, I mean, essentially nothing's off the table, and the government has said that nothing's off the table. But even I think what we would need to respect is that in a lot of countries, they're not willing to cross that divide as well. So they wouldn't give out pelagic or one sector to bring in demersal for another sector because internally that would cause them issues. And it's the same with Faro. It's two different sectors, pelagic and demersal. And whereas we could say, well, let's give up some pelagic and get demersal in return, within Faro, they wouldn't want to do that either because they're pitching one sector against the other sector. So there's a lot of complexities out there that we don't really think of regularly. But whereas it may seem simplistic at the top level, once you start to analyse it all the way down, it becomes slightly problematic because each country's got its different sectors. And one sector in that country is not going to give up anything to benefit another if it's getting nothing in return.
Yeah, no, it's, my goodness, it must be. Do you sleep the night before a meeting?
I don't sleep at all, Jim, hardly. I've got real difficulty sleeping just now for one thing or another. We always state what we want early on, and we just maintain that. As an industry, you couldn't be saying in August that you want apples, and then come October you want oranges or plums. That wouldn't do. So we normally set out our stall, and that's it. We just continue lobby beyond that. I guess at my age, you don't get nervous or anything nowadays. The thing I get more than anything else, Jim, is frustrated. I get frustrated because whereas a particular action or pathway would seem sensible, for whatever reason it's not taken. That does irk me somewhat. But I'm at the age now, you've just got to hide it because the last thing you want to do is give anyone the inkling that they're actually getting at you and it's having an impact. So, yeah, from time to time, you just put on your poker face and just get on with it. It's not ideal, and let's try and fix it in the background. And I always, at times, assume that until a deal's sealed, it's not a deal, and things can be done in the background to try and shape it. And a lot of times, people think things just happen. They don't. So if something just comes out of the blue and it's changed overnight, that doesn't happen by chance. There's a reason as to why it's happened, and somebody's pressed a button.
It's disappointing to hear that from a personal point of view when you're saying there, Michael, that you're feeling frustrated because you've done so well in your career and you're so highly thought of. And even going back to previous podcasts when we're talking about Johnny Thompson, Tom Hay, and the FAL, and that you're always so respectful of people, even people that had a different view to you.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's got a reason for what they do or what they say. And whereas it maybe doesn't fall in line with my views, then you've got to accept someone's point. And I think much of the respect I do get, Jim, is that I did okay when I was fishing. And that's the litmus test for most of my members. Could you hack it in my industry? Well, I was in your industry and I did okay. Having said that, nowadays I fish with the fathers mostly rather than them because they're Gen Z and they're significantly younger than me. But everyone, all they can do is their best. And if at the end of the day people don't think you're doing your best, then I'm sure they'll let you know. But I haven't naturally set out to plan failure. And I always try and make sure that whether we win or lose, notwithstanding, we do our best and no one can challenge that. And at times, leadership is all about that. Leadership is all about stepping out front. I mean, you have to watch you don't get a big space between you and your members so you get shot in the back. But leadership is all about trying to make a difference. If you're not willing to step out there, if you're not willing to try and think through logically and take a certain direction, whereas maybe some people don't agree with you, then at that point, I think it's time for people like me to try and reconsider whether they're doing a good job or a bad job. But there's a lot of committed people out there. I don't think there's anyone in the sector that's not set about trying to do the best for the men, because if nothing else, Jim, we respect them all. We respect the job they do. Being there, it's difficult, and this job's got its own level of difficulty, but it's different. But as a fisherman, I had my happiest days. I had my saddest days. One of the happiest times in my life was fishing out in the Norwegian zone, the height of the summer, big hauls of cod at the daylight, big hauls of cod at the darkening, 5-day landings, running in and running out. Absolute bliss. All I want to do is recover that situation for my members so that they can share in the experiences that I had.
That wasn't the time when you were fishing in and out the Norwegian sector and the lifeboat and coast guards were looking for you.
That's the exact same time, Jim. Yeah, that's the exact same time. And notwithstanding that event, that was a glorious summer, an absolute glorious summer. It was one of the finest periods of my life in terms of fishing. It wasn't always like that. If it was always like that, everyone would want to go to it. We wouldn't have any crewing problems, but that was the happiest days of my life. Yeah, I look back fondly on those times.
When you mentioned Gen Z, I think you could probably come with, well, I've done what you're doing. Now you come and do what I'm doing.
Yeah, there's a lot of good young, bright guys out there. But what we are finding is that no one wants to step up now, take leadership roles, because with the advent of social media, it's very easy to criticise and condemn. And I think that's partly behind why we're now seeing a lack of good, credible people stepping up to the mark, because they don't want the animosity, they don't want the hassle that goes with it. And that's just what, as a modern society, we've developed into.
Yeah, I agree with that. I very often describe social media as the gutter. But saying that, I think even now, as we say in this day and age, you mentioned there that maybe everybody doesn't agree with you from the people that you're talking to and negotiating with. That's correct. They don't agree with you. But let me tell you from somebody that's close connections in the industry, they don't all agree with you maybe, but every one of them respects you.
Well, that's good to know. It's good to know. Yeah, my industry is very good at not saying if you're doing well. Yeah, you're never going to get a pat on the shoulder. That's never going to happen in our industry. It's just the type of people we are. We're alpha males. We get on, we do it. No different ashore as it is offshore. But, we have to understand the difficulty of the job that they carry out and the time they spend away from the families. And that's, at the end of the day, Jim, I'll be honest, that's what started to get me, was the time I was spending away from my family. Albeit in those days, if you wanted to phone home, you had to go through Stonehaven Radio or Stavanger Radio or whatever. Different now, they've all got Wi-Fi and various other things. They can FaceTime their wives and text their wives. So it's significantly different, but no easier leaving your family on a Sunday morning to go away in the boat and leave your kids at home and things like that. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not a natural thing to do either.
Yeah. When you talk about not getting praised or that, I'll never forget a situation in my younger days. I was getting told off by my father, and then my brother says to me, "What did he say?" I said, "Oh, he agreed with me." "Oh, no," he said, "that's even worse."
Yeah, we all try our best and we all try and make a difference. And hopefully, we always say, "Oh, this is it, this is the end." But at the end of the year, we're still there. And as a fleet, as an industry, as a sector, we're still getting on with it. My only hope this year is that the NEFROPs pop their heads up, because these guys have had it difficult. The price of fuel comes down and we find a batch of fish filleters somewhere that solves our issue with small haddocks. And we've cracked it, Jim.
Yeah, no, there's certainly plenty of issues to look at. I do feel with the small haddock situation, the shore side, from what I hear, they're doing more and trying to create a market. But what annoys me, Mike, as far as the haddock are concerned, the market's there. They just need somebody to process them and get them to that market.
I mean, that's the missing element, is actually just workforce. That's the missing element, is the workforce. I mean, offshore, we're trying to solve some of the problem with non-UK crew, whether it be through the transit visa route or a skilled worker route. And onshore, I know now that some of the factories are bringing in processing workers from the Philippines and other countries out there. Myanmar is one of them. But it's not ideal. It's not an ideal world. And I guess in the terms of the catching sector, we've got to work out who the next skippers are going to be.
Yeah. I would like to think baby steps maybe, but the direction's right, because of all the people I've been speaking to, a few podcasts and things like that, there's Fishing into the Future organisation, there's Fishing Innovation and Sustainability. They're all talking with others. There's even got supermarket representatives on their board. So it's taken from the catching to the market and scientists talking around the same table. There must be a benefit coming for that approach.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and social media to a degree in terms of Teams and Zoom and other things have actually helped in that, because people can actually call into meetings or attend meetings online, whereas they couldn't before. And there's numerous people out there who are committing themselves to try and make a difference. You've got Emma Plotnick from, the organisation she said, Cara Bridesden from Fizz. You've got the Sea Alliance, Julia Black from the Hilton Seafood Group in there. And you've got Lynn Foreman, more locally with ASL. So there's a lot of people in there trying to make a difference. They really are trying to make a difference. And on Friday, I was down in London, and in the room we had scientists, we had retail companies, we had processors, we had POs, there was me. Yeah, and we had a good discussion. It was about crew welfare and fisheries in progress and FIPS in terms of Northrop. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot that we're trying to do to solve some of the problems we face. But as we try and solve those problems, in some cases do, others are there creating more problems that we've then got to turn more attention to. And it seems to be, it's a constant now, that whatever you solve, you have to then turn and solve something else. So the majority of the life of me and others is firefighting in many cases, Jim. And that's why I always like getting into the office by at least 7:30 in the morning, because it gives me that hour and a half to try and do some of the things that inadvertently I can't do later because there's wars at play somewhere.
Is there mileage to look at with the Icelandic situation where they would know 10 years in advance what their quotas were?
Yeah, in terms of Iceland, when they were striking a trade agreement with Iceland, we were in there trying to get access to the waters for our vessels. Obviously, that was always going to be a difficult thing, but we continue to make our voice heard with the government in terms of that. The other thing is about getting longer term quotas. The more you push out the extent of how much fish you're going to be allocated, the more conservative they've got to be in that allocation. So every year we get what we get. If you want to make that a 5-year projection, so you get the same over 5 years, because of the risk involved in that, chances are that what you get is less than what you want. And that's the difficulty about giving that long-term predictability. They've got to be ultra cautious. And that's why if you want to fish the maximum sustainable yield each year, then annual TACs is what you need. Plus, you should always be setting a TAC on the best available information. And if you do set a TAC for 5 years, you could have information in year 4 that would allow you to double the TAC, but you can't because you're fixed into that 5 years. So yeah, I would always advocate for annual TACs, but using the best available information. And there's a lot of cases we're not using the best available information, but we need to, going forward, we need to make sure that that is the case.
On a plus note, finish up, Mike, Alan did say, although he had a great concern about the static gear with the gillnet and longline situation in the area they're fishing, he said the docks look good and the future for the industry looks good. So maybe it's a positive one that we are winning the ball.
Yeah, but it's the little things that make a difference, Jim, isn't it? I mean, you've been in business yourself, and turnover is like driving at golf, isn't it? It's the putts that make the difference. And in terms of, the fishing business, it's the profitability that you're trying to deliver. And it's the little things like the price of fuel, the price of fish that shifts that point in terms of profitability. So for me, we need to make sure that we can maintain profitability so that we can reinvest. But also, Jim, I coined a phrase a number of years ago that it's difficult to be green while you're in the red. In other words, if you want sustainable fishing, you want sustainable approaches, it's very easy to do that when people have got money in the bank, they've got investment strategies going forward. But when they've no cash to pay the bills and you're asking them to do things, it means they lose money or less money, generate less money than they could. That's when it starts to hit the carpet. It starts to get difficult. So if we can keep the fleet at profitability, which is difficult in some sectors just now, then, we've got a fair chance going forward. The minute the boats start to lose profitability, they start to go into the red, that's when it starts to become difficult.
That's so true. That's so true, and it's a great way to put it. What is it?
It's difficult to be green when you're in the red.
It's very true of the situation. That reminds me when I was the podcast with Mark Dickey Colas, I said there's a real genuine fear with it. It was a monkfish reduction that they were proposing. Mm-hmm. I said there was a real genuine fear within the fishermen I'm speaking to of not wanting more, but their viability. and continuing in business.
Yeah.
And he accepted that.
Yeah, if you give up something now for the future, then chances are that you will benefit. And just for clarity, Richard Lochhead took that saying off me and said it publicly, and people thought it was his. But he did admit to me later that he coined it from something I said in a meeting. So it was coined by me. It's difficult to be difficult to be green while you're in the red. Yeah, and it is. It's just a fact of life. It's a fact of life that when you're struggling, it's very difficult to do the right things.
It's another true fact of life. If anybody's going to steal anything off you, it's a politician. and claim it for his own.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting chat today, and you made it very, very clear. And I hope you can get a good night's sleep and feel more positive. And that one great thing, it's great to hear that you really do enjoy what you do, because it's a very important job you do. So well done.
And I enjoy it, which is all the main. But it's been nice talking to you, Jim, as well.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you liked it, hit subscribe, share it with a friend, or leave a 5-star review. And if you want to speak with me, visit seafoodmatterspodcast.com.